Hello everyone and welcome to HJW Gaming. Following my first 24-hour guide and also a couple of my season start live streams, I tend to get a lot of questions about what I consider to be most important when starting a new season, and so I've decided to condense that down into 10 key factors that are most important for achieving a good production rating at the end of your first 24 hours. If you haven't seen my previous first 24-hour guide or my live stream of my season start, you can check it out in these two links here and also down in the description. I really hope you enjoy the video. The first and probably most important thing to consider when starting up your new season is your choice of starting commander. As these commanders will be responsible for taking most of your tiles and therefore creating most of your production, these are the most important consideration. When you try to select which commander you would like to use as your initial tiler, there's a couple of things that you should consider. Note that these commanders don't have to be the commanders that you're going to use when it comes to PvP, just those that are most efficient at taking tiles with minimal losses. So the couple of things that I look for when trying to decide who is the best starting commander for me is, first up, I look for damage mitigation. So if a commander has skills that can provide stuns or madness, so crowd control, troop defensive buffs or damage mitigation, or also opposing troop damage debuffs, they'll all be an excellent choice as they can help really minimise those early troop losses. In a similar vein, healing skills are also essential, as if you can get very strong healing, any troop losses that you do sustain, you can recoup the majority of those troops. Obviously, ideally, you'd have a combination of these two, so you can minimise your losses and maximise your healing so that you lose as little as possible. Another consideration, however, is also early round damage. Basically, if you can hit a tile army as quick and hard as possible, then you can obviously take out their army and limit the amount of damage they're going to do to your troops. A great example of this is commanders that have the Convener skill, which grants them initiative, so they can hit the opponent first and take out some of their troops before they can hit you, and also follow up, so that in those first 2 rounds you can deal an enormous amount of damage, double damage. So in particular, that is a very good skill, but there are others which deal great early round damage. My fourth consideration is the commander's role. While this doesn't really come into play until the latter end of the first 24 hours, some roles can really help commanders kick it up a notch. For example, the leader role will see a dramatic improvement once you get access to this, as you'll gain an additional 5 command for your army, which are an additional 500 troops if you're using 100 troops per command compositions. This means a large increase in damage and also a large amount of damage that you can sustain, so you'll get significantly better results on tiles. By level 20 you'll likely be taking around 130-150 power tiles, so having that extra damage will mean significantly less losses on these slightly more difficult tiles. And the last consideration when looking for your choice of starting commander is troop synergy. Your commander either needs to be universal, which means that his skills can buff all types of troops, or he has to synergise well with your starting troops. There's no point using someone like Gil-galad when in Arnor, for example, as you'll start with men units, but all Gil-galad's main damage mitigation and avoidance skills require you to use elves. So you need your commander to synergise well with the troops you have, or else there's no point using them. Once you've chosen your starting commander, the next thing that you have to do is gear him up. Now the gear you select on your commander doesn't have to be their primary PvP best in slot gear. Instead, try to focus on increasing your troops' stats, as of course your starting units will tend to have very low stats, so the gear you use on them will be vitally important. And at the beginning, where most of your skill points are allocated towards healing and damage mitigation, the majority of your damage will be coming from your troops. So it's important therefore to gear them appropriately. For example, a Dwalin with a Flay Axe is excellent in PvP, but as this only provides bonus might and a useful skill towards commander damage, it may not be appropriate for season start. Instead, choosing something like a melee might cutlass or a ranged might Mirkwood bow, depending on what starting troops you have, may be more efficient, as you can increase that damage being dealt by your troops and put your skills into Dwalin's healing skills. You'll see significantly better results on tiles this way. The gear you choose can also be very, very important to counter specific army tiles. I'll get into scouting a little bit later on, but if you know which army you're about to come up with and face, you can choose gear which specifically counters against them. For example, if they're using the Uruk archers or sappers when you get onto 130, 150 power tiles, you can choose to use a fire protection superior hauberk to limit that damage, which you know is going to be the primary damage from that commander. Or if you come up against a commander like Grima, running something like a Resolve Horseman's Helm can be perfect for countering up against the madness that Grima inflicts. If you're not scouting tiles and you're just hitting every tile you see, then I definitely recommend running both of these pieces of equipment just to counter against your worst possible matchups and therefore minimise, the maximum amount of losses that you can take. It will stop you getting shocked by hitting one of these difficult commanders and just losing half your army, which can be immensely frustrating. A couple of examples now of really good starting commanders, ones which I've had much success with. I've got two for the good side. I primarily use Gandalf the Grey. He has early round stuns as a result of wizard and blindside skills. You get damage mitigation from Mithrandir and Free Peoples. You can get evasion from fleeting movements, and you get a nice early round troop damage boost from the Convener skill I mentioned earlier. He's probably the best starting commander in the game, and he only really tails off once you get towards 200 power tiles, which will unlikely be in the first 24 hours. So for that first 24 hours, he is probably the best commander. The second commander I usually use at the beginning as well is Dwalin. He offers troop damage and defensive support from Musician, plenty of healing from Relief and Level Headed, and physical damage reduction in Warrior of the Lonely Mountain. He's worth using for early PvE, as you'll level him up through these tiles, and then he can become an excellent PvP commander as well. So if you get caught short with a very early war, you can just convert him across to a PvP commander, and he'll be equally, if not more, effective. On the evil side, Witch King is known to be kind of the king of PvE. Stuns from Nazgul Screech, damage mitigation from Morgul Commander, and Convener as well as Black Captain and Ring Wraith can mean you can do enormous damage. He also has the leader role I mentioned earlier, so once he hits level 20 he really comes into his own with that additional 5 command, especially if you get access to fire dealing troops such as sappers. He really comes into his own once you hit that 200 tile mark, so if you're in a non-roleplay server, he can be an excellent commander to pair up with Gandalf the Grey so that he really starts to excel, maybe just as Gandalf the Grey starts to drop off a little bit. Another excellent evil choice is Khaldun, as he offers a stun in his Quicksand tree, as well as damage mitigation for Marshal of the Eastmark, Evil Alliance and Iron Guard. The enemy debuff from Easterling and damage buff for Evil Men in Tribal Tactics also come in clutch. The Evil Men buffs are particularly useful as a lot of factions and also the Kings of Men starting units tend to be Evil Men, so he synergizes with these really, really well. Now, moving away from starting commanders, we move on to conscription and troops. Your troops are the most essential resource to maintain in the first 24 hours, as without any troops, you are completely dead in the water. You risk letting stamina maximise and regeneration be wasted, and also risk having a lack of resource due to being unable to sweep with your spare commanders. Therefore, troop levels are essential to everything that you do in the first 24 hours. With that in mind, you should make sure that during the first 24 hours you prioritise conscripting troops and have all conscription queues possible running at all times possible. This means prioritising it over several of the building options, even if you have these available, unless unlocking that building will allow you to progress a chapter or gain a new tier of troops. Even in this situation, after making the building, you should then repeatedly activate the spare queues to make sure that you always have troops coming. You should also be selective about which troops you choose to conscript, and if possible avoid extremely expensive troops like cavalry units. This is so that you do not waste resource and time excessively, and just keep as many troops flowing in as possible. The next thing to consider troop-wise is that when you're marching with your commander, you always have the maximum allocation of troops on that commander. Not doing so and being lazy and just sending them on a second march straight after taking some losses risks you unduly wasting some of the troops on that commander. As you have less troops, you'll deal less damage and likely therefore take more damage. So choosing not to just spend a few seconds reinforcing him can cause you to lose more troops, and if you continuously do that, you'll find yourself being bottlenecked by a lack of troops. And lastly, on troop-wise, spending gold on your troops should not really be avoided, unless your gold is exceedingly sparse or earmarked for something else in the immediate future. You'll likely be using your tier 2 troops, and even some tier 1s, for the entirety of your first 24 hours, so upgrading these can really help a lot in minimising losses as much as possible. Some tier 2 units, such as knights, spearmen, shield bearers and marksmen, all have excellent traits that improve their survivability. At minimum, I would recommend getting this up to level 7 for all of their skills. Thirdly is building prioritization. Now, the first thing you should do upon entering a server, immediately after joining, is build the apothecary and storage. This only takes a few seconds, but is essential as it stops your resources being over the limit and not regenerating, and it also allows you to heal any troops that are wounded when you take tiles. If you decide instead to send out a commander march, and he loses, say, 30 units on that first tile, all of those wounded troops will be dead instead of going to your apothecary, as you do not have one. So therefore, I'd recommend building that as soon as possible and before you take any tiles. Once you start taking tiles and progress your main hall, you'll begin to be constrained by resources, especially if you have all of the troop conscription queues going, so you'll have to begin to make decisions around which buildings to prioritise. In my opinion, the building prioritisation should be as follows. It should be your initial quarters and the barracks for your first troops. So for example, if you're running an Arnor or Gondor, this is getting the tier 2 spearmen. The reason you want to prioritise this as tier 1 troops are pretty weak, and getting tier 2 troops allows you to progress onto taking higher level tiles much sooner. So I would prioritise this until you have access to tier 2 troops. From here, continue to pick up your conscription post and barracks and levelling up your main hall until you get to the point where you have to choose between the military academy and continuing on with this progression. When you get there, I definitely recommend building the military academy first. The reason for this is the additional 2 or 3 command that each level of this gives you makes a massive difference again to how many losses your commander will take on a tile. The higher you can get your military academy early, the quicker you can step on and take those higher power tiles. The only time I would prioritise barracks or conscription post or main hall over the military academy is if you are going to go on to another level of main hall, and that will allow you to get access to, say, tier 3 troops, which can be very useful for taking 200 power tiles. But in general, I would definitely prioritise the military academy. And lastly, I would recommend unlocking the market as soon as you possibly can. The reason for this is it will help you exchange resources and deal with the early lack of resources, particularly stone, early on in the game. Now my fourth consideration is movement and tiles. As soon as the apothecary is built, you should equip your primary tile commanders and send them on a march. If you're playing Season 1 or 2, this will be to a 1 power tile, as your commander will still be level 1, but if you're playing one of the campaign seasons from Bag End, your commander will begin at level 5, and so a well-equipped, suitable starting commander can immediately begin to march on 15 power tiles. Basically, you want to make sure your commander's stamina is always regenerating, so you want to send them on the march as soon as possible so that you can trigger this regeneration to begin. As a general guide, you should only need to take 3 to 4 of the 15, 30 and 40 power tiles per commander before they're high enough level to step on to 60 power tiles. Maybe even wait until you have tier 2 troops just to make sure you reduce losses. So you can just do a couple of those 8 or 9 marches, and then wait until you have tier 2 troops and can then progress further onwards with 60 power plus tiles. And I definitely recommend scouting the tile for an easy army as well when you make this step. More on scouting later on. When tiles of your designated power level are not available, for example, if there are a couple of 15 or 30 power tiles, but they're a couple of tiles away and there are 1 power tiles in between, use commanders who you are not going to be using as your main tiling commanders to path in between these 2 tiles. So this means just sticking some troops on a random commander that you're not going to be using and just get them to march on those 1 power tiles and link you up to the ones you're going to take. The reason for this is you're not therefore wasting stamina on your main tiling commander, and you're just keeping them as much stamina as possible because you're going to need them to be as efficient as possible with taking the highest level tiles possible so that you get as much experience per march as possible. When you get to the point of hitting 130 or 150 power tiles, try to collect as many of these as possible. You may be tempted to try and get a 200 tile as early as in the first 24 hours if you're not taking many losses on these 130 to 150 power tiles. If you've been very efficient, towards the end of your first 24 hours, this will be the case. You'll be taking all 150s with nearly no loss. However, it's definitely not worth trying to step up and pick up a 200 power tile. Just keep picking up 130 and 150s. The reason for this is that the jump up in difficulty is enormous, with the tile armies being 5 levels higher and also there being 2 armies on the tile. The amount of losses that you get troop-wise are just not worth it, and you can't even use it for mind sharpening to level up your commanders anyway until ring level 30, which is not going to happen until day 2 or 3. Now, as I said earlier, I would double back to scouting, and that is my 5th key factor towards progressing well in early game. Scouting a tile is the process of sending a commander you don't otherwise use with the minimal number of troops in order to gain a preview of the army on the tile. What this means is when you hit the tile, this commander with minimum troops will naturally lose, and therefore you will get a report of which commander he lost to. You can take a look at this commander report and decide if it's an easy tile you'd like to send with your main tiler, or if you're going to take too many losses. Scouting a tile before you hit it with your main tiler can have several key advantages. First up, as I said, you can find tiles that have the easiest possible armies. Second, you can see the troop composition and skills of the opposing army and commander, and therefore gear yourself or skill yourself in a way that appropriately counters. Or finally, you can avoid troublesome enemies altogether, such as Grima or the focus build of Carmul, which tend to inflict a large amount of losses, so you can just skip this and move completely onto another tile, as when that 15-minute timer runs out, which was triggered by your scout, these armies will reset and you can then rescout them again and try for a second time. The end result, and why this is so important, is that you essentially minimise troop losses. Because your scout will only have a minimum number of troops, ideally 3-4 troops, you're not really losing any at all, compared to the potentially hundreds of troops that you could lose if you marched your main tiler onto a difficult tile and lost the majority of your army. This therefore means you use significantly less grain resource, not just conscripting, but also in the apothecary, as when you heal troops, it does use up quite a bit of the grain resource. If resource management in the first 24 hours is crucial, and if you have additional grain, that's more conscription you can get done, or it could even be used in the market to make more stone. Basically, keeping troop losses to a minimum is the purpose of scouting, and it is the most important thing. As a bonus tip, when you're scouting, you can use commanders that can inflict madness to maybe get a little bit of an edge via the scout. Normally your scout would just die and not inflict any damage at all, but if you use a commander that can inflict madness, there's a chance that the opposing armies will attack themselves, and therefore they will lose a chunk of their overall command, meaning that when your main tiler comes to hit, you will therefore have less army that you need to defeat. Good examples of this are Frodo and Sam, Isildur and Grima, which can do an excellent job as being your scout. When scouting and looking for easy armies on a tile, I've got a couple examples here for good and evil side as to what I normally look for. When facing evil tiles, I usually look for Maltok, as most of his skills are geared towards wargs, and his armies either don't include wargs or, some very low level tier 1 wargs a lot of the time, which are very, very weak units. Gorbag without trolls can also be a nice one to hit, as well as Ugluk with sappers, as if you wear fire protection, you can minimise the damage you take. And lastly, Yusra tends to have a lot of damage mitigation skills, but almost nothing which actually deals damage, so she can be great to hit. For when hitting good side tiles, Ori is a legendarily weak commander. Arwen is very similar to Yusra, except healing wise, is that she has a lot of heal skills, but nothing which deals any damage. And finally, Eomer can be a great to hit, particularly I think on 90 to 130 tiles, if he doesn't have cavalry in his army, as all his skills will be geared towards cavalry, but his troops will not be able to gain that benefit. So if you can look for these armies, you can hit them and take them with almost no loss, or you can maybe take them a couple of levels lower than you usually would aim for with that tile. The sixth consideration I look at is resources. As I said earlier, efficiency with your resource and efficient resource management will be essential and will define how quickly you can develop during that first 24 hours. Initially, you'll find that during chapter completion, you will be completely overflowing with resources as you complete chapters quick and fast, and you keep getting the chapter reward resources. However, after a while, you will begin to run low on resources, particularly if you're keeping those conscription queues running as much as possible. And also, after several completed chapters, you'll notice that the stone reward stops being provided. So you will get a severe depletion of this resource, which limits how much building you can do. It's therefore recommended that when you hit the capability to hit 40, 90 and 150 power tiles, you focus primarily on picking up stone tiles. You want the majority of your production to be on the stone resource so that you don't get bottlenecked by lack of stone. Additionally, when you get onto 150 power tiles, it's recommended you pick up one of stone and wood so that you can use this for gathering should you run low on this resource and therefore not have to exchange another resource in the market. Speaking of the market, you need to try and avoid utilising the market as much as possible. If you use this too often, you will find that you regularly hit a resource bottleneck. At level 1, the market is extremely ineffective as you actually lose 60% of the resource you're exchanging. So if I traded 1,000 grain, I'd only get 400 stone, and then that other 600 resource is gone. So it's extremely wasteful. My only possible exception to this is with the grain resource, as if you have a lot of mobs nearby you, you can replenish this much easier than any of the other resources. But in general, try to avoid utilising the market too often. My seventh key element of the first 24 hours is sweeping. Sweeping is the process of defeating AI-controlled armies which can stand on some tiles, and these mobs can range between level 6 and level 40, though during the first 24 hours you will only have level 6 and 10 mobs to contend with. To prevent your progress being bottlenecked by lack of resources, it's important to sweep as much as possible. When you defeat a mob, you gain some very useful rewards, such as experience for the commander that did the sweep, as well as speed up tokens that can help you speed through building, troop healing or commander recalls. These can really help you progress, as if you do not wish to spend gems to speed up these actions, you can therefore use these speed up tokens. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, you also receive an amount of grain depending on the level of mob you defeated. I recommend sweeping as many mobs as possible to keep a steady flow of grain. The commanders you should use to do sweeping should not be your main tile-taking commanders. You want to keep their stamina just for taking those highest power tiles possible. Instead, I would look for other commanders with the same kind of abilities as I mentioned in the first section of this guide, healing and damage mitigation, and select them to do their sweeping, as therefore they'll lose the least amount of troops possible whilst doing these sweeps and keep you in positive resource. You can also choose to use the commanders that you would use in PvP later on, just to give them a head start in early levelling, so they're ready that when war comes, you can level them up much quicker. Mobs can also provide you with Tavern tips, which when completed can provide you with additional gold or resources. In particular, the resource ones can be very useful, as of course getting an extra amount of resource on top of the amount you gain from the sweep can again help you prevent that resource bottleneck. We will talk about Tavern tips a little bit more in the future. Eighth on my list of important considerations is your use of ability points. Ability points are another resource which needs to be carefully managed in order to maximise your output in the first 24 hours. When you first load into your new server, you will have the maximum number of ability points at that time, which is 20. However, as this resource regenerates over time, every second that you are at maximum ability points, you're essentially wasting this regeneration. Therefore, it's beneficial to try and use some of these as soon as possible to gain a useful benefit and prevent potentially wasted regenerated ability points. In the first 24 hours, there's a couple of useful options for using your ability points. The first of these is the time out of time skill. This is potentially the worst use of your ability points, and I definitely recommend avoiding using this. Time out of time allows you to finish a construction which has less than 10 minutes remaining. But you could equally do this with a speed up gained from mobs or by spending a few gems and not wasting a resource as important as ability points. It's only really useful for free to play players who do not want to use gems and have no speed ups available. But overall, I would definitely recommend avoiding this as much as possible. Your next option is to extract, which is the process of spending 3 ability points to instantly gain some additional resource from one of your tiles, depending on the level of tile. I'd recommend only doing this once, maybe twice, as soon as you have a 40 power stone tile. This will ease your stone resource bottleneck, which you'll be hitting around this point, as well as starting that AP regeneration. But I wouldn't recommend using it again, as you have the next skill available as soon as you hit ring level 10. The next ring skill that I want to talk about is gathering. So as soon as you hit ring level 10, you should reskill your ring instantly in order to get access to gather. You can therefore expend 1 ability point and 5 commander stamina per 10 minutes in exchange for additional resource from a tile. Now, unlike extract, you do have to wait for that commander to march to the tile and then expend that allocated time before you get the resource, whereas extract you get it instantly. However, you do get additional resource compared to extract, so this is better value per ability point. Whenever you bottleneck on a resource, you should gather on your highest power tile for that resource in order to loosen up that bottleneck as soon as possible. The last option in the first 24 hours is conversion, which is only relevant if you're playing on a Kings of Men server. It's an additional ring skill which allows you to spend 10 ability points to convert all the troops from a nearby mob into your army. I would not recommend using this particularly in your first 24 hours, as the mob troops are not strong enough to be very useful, and 10 ability points is far too expensive when you compare to how much more benefit you'd get from gathering or extracting. And ninth in consideration is the Tavern. The Tavern can provide some very useful benefits in the first 24 hours, though need to be managed appropriately. Firstly, at server refresh, which is midnight UTC, you'll have 4 Tavern tips which refresh and can be refreshed twice more for a cost of initially 200 gems, and then the second time is 400 gems. These tips can provide Commander Respect, Mithril tokens and random gear. Additionally, in your first set of tips per day, you get a bonus Caravan tip that involves marching a commander to a tile to gain an amount of each resource. During the first 24 hours, this will be 10k of each resource. Now, I recommend completing the Caravan tip as soon as you have it available to prevent you from hitting a resource bottleneck. However, all other tips you shouldn't even click on or accept until as late as possible, as close to that midnight refresh for the next day as possible. The reason for this is after server chapter 2 is completed, tips begin to also reward you with commander experience. As tips expire after 48 hours, if you delay keeping hold of these for as long as possible, you can therefore keep them as long as possible just in your tavern. So if you're lucky, your server will progress beyond chapter 2, around the middle of the 3rd day, and you can then speed through those tips, gaining additional commander experience, which can be very useful for leveling your commanders without use of stamina. The second service the Tavern provides that can be very useful is the ability to sell your excess gear for gold. If you have spare green and blue gear that you will not be using, then I recommend selling it for gold and then using that gold to upgrade your troops to minimise your troop losses through their improved skills. And last up on my considerations, unfortunately, is purchases. As this is a gacha game, you do get significant advantages through the purchase options. So there's a few here which I would consider to be pretty essential in order to get number 1 production, as your rivals will be using them, you can guarantee. So the first up is the third construction queue, which can be purchased for £5 in my currency, or your relative exchange rate to your currency. And it allows you to have 3 simultaneous building constructions going on at the same time instead of 2. Particularly in the first few hours, this is crucial as it means you can constantly have things towards chapter progression building. Second up, there's a limited time gift pack available for £5 or relative exchange rate that provides you with 4 Mathams and, more importantly, 1 stamina tincture. This simile is very useful as during the first 24 hours, the bonus 60 stamina you get from the tincture can allow 6 additional marches when used on your main tiler. So the ability to pick up 6 more tiles will mean a massive amount of additional experience and of course the resource that comes with taking those tiles. Lastly, purchase, at least for money wise, is the limited time gift pack for the resource bonus, which will increase your resource production by 20% for 8 hours on all 4 resources. And 20% is obviously a huge advantage on any competition that are not using this. Next up, if you scroll to daily discount, you'll also find some beneficial items you can purchase for gems. First up is the Unstoppable pack, which allows you to purchase single stamina tinctures for 600 gems, though usually these are not available in the first 24 hours. Battle Readiness gives you a token to boost mock battle experience, which won't be useful, at least in the first 24 hours, but more importantly it also gives you a token to increase the resource provided through gathering. This will be very useful as you'll find yourself regularly gathering in that first 24 hours. Finally, you'll also find increased resource production tokens here for 50 gems per resource, and similarly you get 20% additional resource production through use of these, though they only last 3 hours rather than the 8 hours from the limited time gift pack. And with that, that's everything I have to offer. If you have enjoyed this, please drop a like and please consider checking out my live streams for my season starts and also my previous first 24-hour guide, which has a lot more demonstrations of these tips in use and also me getting number 1 by the end of the 24 hours. If you have enjoyed, please consider subscribing as it makes a massive difference to my channel and then you can see more of my content coming up in future. If you do choose to do that, I really hope to see you on the next one.